This is the official podcast of the G20 Interfaith Forum, where we discuss the key events, the goals, and the focus of the organization.
Welcome to G20 Interfaith Forum podcast. I'm Marianna Richardson.
And I'm Stuart Bird.
Today we're going to be talking specifically with the Human Trafficking Working Group. We're very excited about this podcast to be able to have them talk about their expertise, but also some of the goals, the aspirations, what they're looking forward to in terms of the future. We want to start with them introducing themselves, and we're going to start with Kevin. Kevin, would you just kind of tell a little bit about your background and who you are?
Yes, thank you, Marianna and Stuart, for organising this event. And my name's Kevin Hyland. I'm a British-Irish citizen, and I'm formerly a police officer of 30 years and in the military before that. And also I was the UK's first independent anti-slavery commissioner. And that was a role that was created under statute of the Modern Slavery Act and would advise the government but have a statutory role over most services in the United Kingdom, including police, health services, local authorities, and some of the other law enforcement agencies. And they had to assist me in developing strategies to fight human trafficking. When I was a police officer, my last role was running London's human trafficking teams, and we got record numbers of convictions, identified victims, and worked across the world really on pursuing and prosecuting traffickers, but always putting victims at the centre of what we were doing. I've also been Ireland's representative of the Council of Europe for Human Trafficking and helped set up, was one of the co-founders of the Santa Marta Group, which is established with the support of Pope Francis, which brings together law enforcement, statutory agencies, and faith, not just Catholic faith, but all faiths, and people of goodwill to fight against trafficking. And I was the author of 8.7, which is the Sustainable Development Goals for fighting human trafficking. I now work with a number of organisations as charitable, as the chair or on the board fighting human trafficking, particularly with religious sisters, but I'm the CEO of Praeveni Global, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. So wonderful to join you all.
Well, Kevin, boy, just listening to all that you've done, we are so grateful that you're with us in this amazing opportunity for IF20 to really take this on and see if we can really make a difference in the world. Duncan, do you want to just talk a little bit about yourself too? Because I know you're just as amazing. So
I don't know about that. Thank you, Marianna, and thank you, Stuart, for inviting me. So my name is Duncan Jepson. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations for Praeveni Global, an NGO that Kevin and I established during the course of last year and were then joined very quickly by Fred. So it's great to speak about this. Briefly about my background. Prior to Praeveni, I had founded an NGO called Liberty Shared, which began its life as Liberty Asia in Hong Kong. And we focused on human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, and environmental crimes. And really that was a response to my previous life, which was as a general counsel and head of compliance across Asia in the financial services industry, where during the crash, I'd seen quite a lot of, let's put it, unregulated and criminal activity in the financial industry and been involved in quite a lot of internal investigation in that. And part of my experience of that brought me to response to human trafficking. And I left financial industry and created an NGO, and that went on for about 12 years. Prior to that, as a lawyer, I'd been a filmmaker and a writer, coming out of university, I worked in supply chains in China back in the early 90s when it was a much more nascent, complicated, but sort of the wild east, let's call it, of the global economy. So I will leave it there and for Fred.
And Fred, we're so excited to have you as, a part of this group. You're kind of on the IF20 role, but we'd love to talk to how you kind of take over IF20 side, plus your work with this group.
Thank you, Marianna, and thank you, Stuart. Really appreciate all the effort you go to make these podcasts and our communications as a whole. My role with IF20 has been to try to coordinate the work of what we term working groups. There are so many issues of importance to the interfaith community in the world that need attention at the G20 governmental level. And my role has been to help coordinate those efforts with the central steering committee of the group. And I have to admit, Kevin and Duncan enticed me to put most of my energy and focus as time evolved into the human trafficking working group. So they kindly invited me to join the Praeveni board. My personal background, I had a career in Washington, D.C. for about 35 years, centered on the Middle East. And I would say the high points of that experience were my involvement in Arab-Israeli peace negotiations for 6 or 7 years in the 90s. That seems to be a very distant hope right about now with all the commotion in that part of the world. But I would say this, because human trafficking is such a daunting humanitarian concern and a global one, having had the experience of in the 1990s of going to work every day and feeling that you could accomplish something, that almost impossible tasks were being realized. I still feed off of that energy, seeing the Israeli representative surrounded by 15 or 16 Arab government and party representatives. Anyway, I bring an international perspective and probably a slightly obnoxiously optimistic one. I think we really can achieve great things. And it's a privilege to work with Kevin and Duncan in this regard.
Well, we definitely need that optimism, especially today. So thank you for bringing that into the discussion.
Thank you.
It's fascinating to hear how each of you have such different backgrounds, but you've all come together on this issue of human trafficking. I would love to hear each of you explain how your backgrounds shape your current role and your current plans for combating human trafficking. Starting with Kevin, I know you have the background in law enforcement. Where do you see law enforcement being an essential part of combating human trafficking and your role included in that?
Sure. Well, obviously, I spent 3 decades in law enforcement, and I see that's one element. This is a crime. It's a very serious crime. It takes away people's human dignity, and people make a lot of money out of it. That is the main driver. So the law enforcement and rule of law and governance that needs to be there and taking away the incentive to commit crime is important. But I think there's a much bigger area to look at. And when, for example, I was a police officer and I was planning the prevention of human trafficking for the 2012 Olympics in London. And what was going to be important there was to be able to prevent human trafficking. And the way that I went about that was working with many partners. And one partner that was really crucial to that was groups of religious sisters in London, because they were working with women who were exploited, particularly in sexual exploitation. They were working on many things that were being left. There were gaps formed. And of course, the traffickers that were looking to use the event were looking at the people who were vulnerable and how they could exploit the vulnerable or bring in people en masse to exploit them, particularly in sexual exploitation, but also on forced labor. So I introduced a policy process where I involved LOCOG, which was the London organising group of the Olympics, the police, the health service, the contractors, the actual merchandise organisations, to work out how we could prevent, forced labour, but then also merchandise that may be brought through as a result of exploitation in other countries, or people may be forced to sell it, and of course, sexual exploitation. And so, the women that would be brought in. And by working in this partnership, and then, working with those who are on the front line, and then creating alternatives, particularly when women were in sexual exploitation, I was actually really annoyed that women who are working in prostitution will be arrested if it's in the street. There isn't a crime if it's off the street in the UK for the women. But if it was in the street, and then they'd be charged, it's a fine only, they wouldn't pay the fine, then they go to prison and it would all start again. And so giving them options and pathways. And that's what I saw was a real alternative, giving people pathways. And then I was asked to help design legislation with the government. And so I saw there are many ways to tackle human trafficking, but particularly in prevention. And prevention is what Praeveni means in Latin. And that's what I really see as the way forward. How can we build in prevention? How can we disincentivize people and companies and countries and those who commit these crimes? How can we enable people to be more resilient to it? And how do we create particularly the areas of the world that may be more vulnerable to it, or the communities? If we can work along those measures, we can really start to prevent this crime and turn, I think, what I heard there about opportunity and Fred's opportunity, turn something using hope, but using opportunity and being optimistic to eliminate this in a very structured, positive way. But remembering, people are imperfect, the world is imperfect. And so we have to take the blows that come and the negativity that comes and just keep our piece of work going. I think that's what's needed.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Duncan, I would now love to hear your plan for combating human trafficking, as you are an expert in institutions and NGOs, not only starting institutions and NGOs, but sometimes investigating them as well. So I would love to hear your plan to combat human trafficking in your sphere.
I'm gonna call upon two wise individuals who I think are worth quoting. One is Eisenhower, who said, "Plans are nothing, planning is everything." And the other one is Mike Tyson, who said, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And I think the reason that I used to these were the opening statements I used to teach at the National Defense University when we teach strategic leadership, because you always have to remember that you are working and operating in a complex adaptive system. That's the world we live in. It's complexity, change, adaptation, and that creates vulnerability. If you don't have the resources to adapt, or the people that you're relying on to bring you resilience, to change your risk, they don't have resources, then you are truly vulnerable. And that's what we find with a lot of people. 1.6 billion people in poverty, earning less than $3.25 a day. And remember, that doesn't turn up in your bank at the end of the day. You don't get $3. You might get nothing for weeks, and then you get $20. And so that precarity is like that. You might be at the risk of violence, of sexual violence, or just straight of physical violence in a broad form. And whatever we want to pick, what our planning must be about is, how do we build, exactly as Kevin said, how do we build greater resilience into the environment so that, sure, it's going to adapt, it's going to change, but it's going to change in a way that is biased towards reducing vulnerability. And we're going to have to be on top of it all the time. There's going to be no moment where it's like, this thing is done. We're going to have to keep going. So our job at Praeveni is, we're going to talk about prevention, and we're going to talk about what do we need today that's going to improve, increase prevention. And it isn't going to be a one thing fits all. It's going to be contextual, it's going to be subtle, it's going to be nuanced. And we're going to have to be clever, because the people who want to make money, as Kevin said, out of exploitation, they are just as clever. I'm not saying there are 5 people sitting on a podcast talking about how to exploit people, but there are definitely 5 people sitting in a room thinking, how do we make money out of global supply chains? And they're doing it very fast, because they're not worried about laws and regulations and having a meeting. They're like, get on WhatsApp or get on Signal or be in the dark web and just make plans and sell stuff and sell people. So our plan is to be planning, to be adaptive, to be quick, to be bright, and to make sure that things get executed and implemented. And for that, we need resources. And so Praeveni is about raising resources and understanding how they can be applied in a quick and smart way in some cases. And sometimes it's going to be about building something that's long-term, but we're heading towards greater resilience for vulnerable people and less resilience for perpetrators. And that's the other side of that coin. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Duncan. Thank you. Fred, I would love to hear your plan. You are an expert in bringing people together, and it sounds like trying to foster peaceful relations. And that's a big focus of IF20 and also your career. If you could explain your plan to combat human trafficking, that would be wonderful.
Really, my plan is basically to support Kevin and Duncan. And for given my experience in government in the past, let me just emphasize that what we're trying to do is a little bit challenging in a couple of ways. We're trying to build a long-term campaign over the course of several years to convince governments in the G20 to spend more resources to combat human trafficking. So that's the number one thing, is to shift the balance of effort away from NGOs, nonprofit organizations, to governments. The work that Kevin and Duncan have outlined, identifying global supply chains, making them transparent. This is a complex global effort that governments need to be involved with. NGOs have had a role for the past quarter century at least. That role has been very important, particularly in victim support, but also in other areas, as Kevin has pointed out, the Sisters in London. Counterterrorism and national security was one area I worked in. When I realized that NGOs in many countries are the ones giving training to government officials on how to combat um, human trafficking. Can you imagine if an NGO were training the United States government on how to combat terrorism or how to combat drug trafficking? It makes no sense. Um, the initiatives that need to happen at the governmental are vital. The other piece, again, and both Kevin and Duncan have alluded to it, this is a global initiative. When I was in government, I helped work in an arena of chemical weapons. Very few people realize that there are about 20 countries around the world that share intelligence, that meet on a regular basis to look at precursors that go into chemical weapons and how they're marketed, how they're trafficked. Um, to have build that kind of coordination, a culture of collaboration like that takes years and years, but it becomes effective with time. So an effort that is based on governmental initiative and global is it's a long-term objective. Maybe I won't say it's unrealistic, but it is what I guess I'm committed to in supporting Kevin and Duncan.
I so appreciate all of these insights that we've had and your and the understanding of your background. I mean, it's pretty amazing to see three people who have such diverse backgrounds coming together on this very complicated but so important issue. Um, my next question has to do very specifically with G20 Interfaith Forum. What led you to start working with IF20? How things have gone? What's the dream? What do you see as the future? All of those kinds of thoughts and feelings that you have as a group, as a team.
I'll kick. I was the latecomer and the last person introduced to the Interfaith Forum by Kevin, and then introduced to Fred. And I would say, it was not something I had thought about or learned about much, but things that mattered to me personally were human dignity, that things be done with humility, that they be done with respect. And having been in the private sector, been in civil society, that's not always the case, right? Humility and human dignity are not always things that people are thinking about often, or if at all. And listening to Kevin when he was talking about the Interfaith Forum and about the work and the planning, I thought, there's these themes keep reoccurring, and Kevin is a really good exemplar of that. So that drew me to ask, okay, what's happening, what's going on here, and then of course there's a focus on human trafficking, so that's an easy one, but for me, those characteristics of its nature, of the nature of the people, to share, to think about, to do it in a humble way, to think about human dignity. I mean, these are things that whether you're a person of faith or not, in a secular world, they're still important things, right? They're important ways to behave. So that there is a place where that happens, I think, is a good thing for the world, and that the IF20 has taken up human trafficking as an important issue. These comes together, and it's a great place for people to come and connect, and a great community.
I also wanted to stress, we are an interfaith organization, that each one of us here, we are all people of faith, but different faiths. And that's one of the reasons why I really like the G20 Interfaith Forum, in that it brings people of faith and also people of spirituality. I mean, it doesn't even have to be organized religion, but people usually of faith, like you said, are usually concerned about these issues. And that is something that I think that brings us together, especially when we talk about something that is so morally reprehensible as human trafficking. Kevin, do you have any thoughts too about, you've probably been with IF20 as long as anybody in this group?
Yes, so my first engagement with the IF20 was in 2018 in Argentina. And the timing was great, because at that time I had a very strong relationship with the Argentinian government, and particularly the Argentinian ambassador in the UN in New York and also in London. And we'd worked together on a number of projects, including working with the government in Argentina and the interior minister about getting more resilience together. And she held an event on another occasion I went to Argentina, where she brought all the security services together, talking like Duncan was there and like Fred were, talking about what assets have they got that could really take this to the front line. And then I saw legislation change and things like that. But when I went to the event in Argentina, it was an awakening to me in many ways, for the reasons you say, Mariana. All these different faith groups, I mean, completely different. And that was an education to me in a really positive way. And I'd done quite a bit with different faith, maybe more with Catholic and more with Christian. But as you say, the interfaith is much wider. And then linking that to what the G20 is. And I saw there was real potential there. I thought, this is really clever. People who are really concerned about social issues. They may not all be experts. There may be some that are coming in very different ways towards the issue. But it gave you real space to discuss things and to start to understand things and to access different ideas and views. And then to place that in front of the 20 world's leaders in the most wealthy countries that represent, 85% of the world's economy. That I thought was unique. And at that point in Argentina, I thought, I'm staying with this. This is so important. And it has been a slow burn in some ways, like Fred said. But now we are very comfortable with what we're doing. We're committed. We understand where we fit in this more than we did, say, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And we're going from strength to strength, I think, because we're very clear about what our mission is, like Fred said, to get more investment from G20 countries, because it's the IF20 as part of the G20. So we're going into it with the human trafficking with a very clear mission. And of course, we get very senior people coming to it. We have former prime ministers, we have serving ministers, we have high-level faith leaders, we've got a good media outlet, we've got access to very senior levels within the church and within governments, and in the US and UK, and say, for example, in Ireland, where we had the former Prime Minister, the former Taoiseach, attend in Tokyo, who has access to all the different networks in Ireland. So I see it's got real potential. And then, of course, it gives us the opportunity to educate people of influence. So what I thought was really good when we were in Argentina and other events as well is when we do these recordings and interviews, and CNN followed on with some of that with me separately, and it really is getting it into the bloodstream of the global network of governments. One person who is a man of faith, who I speak with regular and advises on this, is Gordon Brown. And of course, Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, was involved very much in the formation of the G20 in the economic crises back in the 90s and 2000s. And he said to me that this really is a vehicle to make change, but just make sure you're always talking to it in the language of the G20, because, you know, the G20 will, as we know, does respect faith and faith leaders and what faith views are, because the democracies that we're part of, we're all part of citizens of those democracies. But actually, what comes with it is that there is a kudos, a clarity, a reason why we're doing it. And one thing I just want to put in here, really, you know, somebody who I think was a great leader in the world, Nelson Mandela. And yes, sometimes this is really hard, but one of the famous quotes of Nelson Mandela was, everything seems impossible until it's done. And I always remind myself of that, and it may not be us that do it. It may be that we set it all up for the next generation to finish the game or to finish the work. But we need to keep going, even though at times it seems impossible.
Kevin, I love your message of hope. You know, and I think that's something that we always have to think about when we're talking about these kinds of issues. There is hope that we can solve these problems. So I know, Fred, that's one of the things that you feel very strongly about, is this message of hope. What is your thought in terms of IF20 and this human trafficking issue that we're trying to tackle?
Going back to my years in the Middle East negotiations, looking back, one of the pretty serious constraints we had, it was very difficult to address religion directly as a factor in the negotiations. There were kind of limitations, cultural limitations, even legal limitations on how you could approach foreign policy questions in a way that involved religion. It's been characterized as the missing element in diplomacy and in national strategy. But in the early 2000s, I learned a bit about how much good is being done in the world by the faith communities. The World Bank actually was a leader in this, a woman by the name of Catherine Marshall, who's a part of the IF20, was asked to form an office back in the year 2000, I think, in the World Bank to develop relationships with the global faith communities. Why? Because the World Bank realized how much of what they were seeking to do was actually being done, being managed by faith groups. In Uganda, 75% of the hospitals in the country are run by mosques or faith groups. The development of programs to combat malaria rely heavily in Africa on the trust generated by faith leaders. That messaging to combat malaria and various ways to do that is dependent heavily on faith group leaders. I was privileged to join in 2014 the very first Interfaith Forum. And that was the result of simply one professor at a local university who said, it's important that the G20 realize the faith communities of the world have a voice. It's a responsible voice, an informed voice on policy issues that face the G20. That's how I got involved. And again, it is because of kind of the revelation, if you will, how much faith communities can do, how important it is, as you said, Marianna, this is human slavery, human trafficking, modern slavery is a moral outrage that really has no place in the world of the 21st century. And who better to articulate that and to give passion to that than the faith communities that we are privileged, each one of us, to be involved with.
You know, thank you so much for this important message that so much of what we're doing in terms of this area too, and what's being done, is usually done through faith groups or nonprofits or NPOs that are faith-based or faith, religions or faith groups are paying for it. And so to have that also as an understanding, I think is really positive.
Well, thank you. It's a question that's a delight to answer. And again, as I look at Kevin and Duncan, their faces on the screen right now, you think of, we talk a lot of detail and focus and how to make meetings happen and what to discuss, but underlying is the trust that comes from the common intensity of faith that we share. It's a lovely thing, faith that informs trust like that and makes a difference in how you work.
Thank you so much for sharing those. I know that IF20 is better with your collaboration and your help. We know that in addition to IF20, all three of you are involved with Praeveni Global, and I know that Duncan talked about that and what the organization does. In addition to what you've already mentioned, Duncan, is there anything you'd like to add about what our listeners should know about Praeveni Global?
I think the first thing is that, Praeveni came out of conversations that Kevin and I had been having for a couple of years. And I think there was an absolute agreement by Kevin and I that, firstly, humanity has decided after a few thousand years that exploiting people is a crime, and people who do it should be punished. And eventually, this, in the 20th century, largely most jurisdictions, countries in the world have laws that make it a crime, but where it falls apart is that they're not being enforced. And so people are continuing to do this, exploit other people for their own gain. So first of all, Praeveni is, we want to make sure that there is better criminal justice, because deterrence is a part of prevention. Punishment is unfortunately a part of prevention, but also restitution and justice is a pretty strong part of prevention. And so that's a number one element that I think Kevin and I agree on. And I'm going to do my thing here, and then I'm going to ask Kevin to hopefully agree with me. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is that if we're going to do that, then we need resources to do it. And this is woefully under-resourced. And Kevin came up with this idea of there needs to be a lot more resources, and we want $30 billion per year by 2030 from at least G20 countries. So a straight ask. And so that's Praeveni's mission: increase resources for mechanisms such as criminal justice. But we also know that, as Kevin said earlier, that there's benefit. People do this for benefit. They're not doing it because they're all psychopaths. They're doing it because they want something out of it, and it's generally money. And so we need to make sure that it is much harder to make money and to move money and to enjoy the benefits of, by perpetrators and criminals of modern slavery and exploitation. So these are sort of very technical and structured ideas, but this isn't really going to work unless we have, as Fred said, we have community, we have sharing of ideas, we have communication, we have a movement. And so we need a vehicle, we need a name, we need messaging, we need more than just a conversation and speaking. So we created an organization, we've given it some life now. It's been only 6 months. It's been an absolute, a joy, and to be able to then build a working group with the IF20 to do some webinars, to start to talk about meetings. I'm very grateful to be invited to the meeting, IF20 meeting in August, to be part of the conversation there. So I think those are things we're concentrating on: resources for prevention, and then how they're applied, as both Kevin and Fred said earlier in this discussion.
Yes, and I think what's important, and Duncan has expressed this, and Fred earlier, I think Fred's remarks about investigating or the crimes of terrorism or drug running or money laundering or corruption, that we have NGOs training and taking responsibility across the world. And, for 25 years since the Palermo Protocol came in, we've seen, more victims being identified, but fewer prosecutions and, fewer assets being made available to go after those who commit these crimes. And when I say go after them, I also mean about prevention, because prevention is very much about how you put structures in place. And, with trafficking, we always hear it's impossible to convict. It's impossible without the victims. But I have got the first-hand experience to know how to convict people without ever having a victim come forward, because the traffickers have to communicate. They have to do the very things that other criminals do. They have to use phones. They have to book rooms. They have to book airplanes, or they have to have transport. All of that can be evidence. They have to move money. And it's quite easy when you've got the skills and you've got the expertise to deal with it and to put that in an evidential format and then pursue them. And I remember that when we would pursue cases that ran across 5 countries and everybody'd say it's impossible. And it goes back to that, it's always impossible until it's done. And we used to make this happen. I had a good team. I had a number of people, different departments, but we would make it happen. And I would like to see that multiplied, and Praeveni can be the vehicle to make that happen. But also then how we work with governments. And it's going to be a big shift to change the agenda at the moment, whereby the approach to trafficking is very much about after the horse has bolted and dealing with it afterwards. Yes, that's important to be able to give the care to the victims, but even that care is ad hoc. It's not structured. It's not part of ever being reviewed. And if you look in the UK at the moment as an example, there's just been an inquiry launched because of the amount of children who were being exploited and trafficked and used, and how nothing was happening to support them. And this goes back now since to 2010, 2012. And it's because too many people were looking at it as an academic issue or as a, how do I do the next report? As opposed to people going in and saying, this is what is needed. We have the skills to do this. We have the expertise. If there's a deficit of law around proving the cases, we need to address that. And, there are many countries that do not have laws that support victims. And for example, the work I'm doing with the Attorney General's Alliance in association with Praeveni is about how more could be done online and how more law enforcement is required online and how that can be developed by attorney generals with legislatives at state level. Or in one area, they want to look at better compensation laws, copying European laws around that. And so we're going to be looking at all those issues. But our whole desire is to start to measure trafficking on how we're starting to see it being suppressed, how we're starting to see it being reduced, how we're seeing it being part of the infrastructure of daily life. What I would love to see, and my aim is, when we live in our developed worlds and our more Western worlds, we get up, we have children, and we don't have to think about how our children or if our children are ever going to go to school, because it's part of the structural processes of society. When we buy a car or we drive a car, okay, people do break the rules, but there's structures about how you become licensed to drive the car. The licensing, the examinations, the qualifications, products we buy around food and restaurants. There's whole processes that make sure that they are clean. And when they're not clean or they're not serving right, there are sanctions. Surely by now, 200 years plus after the transatlantic slave trade and the days of Lincoln and people, those great leaders of the world who got rid of this and said it wasn't acceptable. It's a real, disgrace that we're carrying, that we've allowed it to come back in bigger ways than it ever has been. And it's hidden, but hidden in plain sight. It can happen on a high street in New York or London or Paris, and yet nothing is done about it. And then we all say, well, that was terrible when we find out about it or we read about it. So let's get this integrated into societal norms that it cannot happen, and systems need to prevent it. And if it does go wrong, systems will intervene that are efficient, effective, give victims pathways to recovery and to reconstructing their lives, and actually prosecute the criminals. That's what I would like to see, and that's what Praeveni's aim is. And very much we see the IF20 and G20 as being a vehicle and a platform to bring that.
I did want to kind of go with one of your points that are so important that you just made, and I would love all of you to kind of discuss it. But what are some of the lesser known parts of human trafficking in 2025? I think one of the biggest problems that we have when we're dealing with this, you mentioned, Kevin, about how, this is an even bigger problem than it's been in the past. And not only that, but it's also more pervasive. Usually most people think, oh, it's just sex trafficking. This only has to do with women or young girls. And yet, as I've, learned more about this because of, this wonderful human trafficking group that's trying to stop it, I've also realized this is so much greater than just that problem. And so I would, love just for a moment for you to kind of help other people to understand the depth of this issue, because I think sometimes we just see it as that one layer rather than the depth of what's happening in the world.
I might jump in here, Marianne. I know Kevin's got a very good answer, but I thought just one small data point. If you take the G20 governments, and this goes out again, the idea of the importance of governmental initiative. If you take the G20 governments, their economic power in the world, just the procurement that those governments do in the marketplace is a huge proportion of the world's economy. If each one of those governments effectively policed their own global supply chains for purposes of blocking, preventing, sorting out, ferreting out human trafficking, it would be one of the largest steps that could be taken to mitigate human trafficking in the world. It's a huge thing to ask a government to monitor and track its own global supply chains. But suddenly you think, wait, we have AI as a new tool in processing information. There are horizons out there like the one I'm alluding to here, where a lot could be done, again, with governmental collaboration and initiative. But I just thought that one little piece of thinking about what governments procure in the marketplace and the supply chains that support those procurements, if governments were serious about monitoring their own supply chains, it could make a huge difference. Anyway, Kevin, I hope I haven't stolen your thunder. This is a point that I learned at your tutelage, but I thought I'd just drop it in there.
No, thank you, Fred. And it's such an important element to remember. Government procurement money is taxpayers' money. No government has ever put in its manifesto that it's going to involve itself in human trafficking and modern slavery. It has not got permission to spend our money or the taxpayers' money on modern slavery and human trafficking. And there may be different views on, armaments and military powers and all the rest of it. But that is in a government's manifesto, that they can spend our money on military hardware and so forth, and is obviously necessary. But we've never authorized them to spend our money. And actually, they would say that they're against it. So they need to do more. But I think when we look at, the unusual elements in 2025 and how it's developed, there are things, for example, the issue in the United States, for example, of trafficking of young girls and young women. And it's an enormous problem. But it is looked upon case by case. And I was dealing with a case with one of the southern states recently, and they had looked at a case that was very localized in a small city in the south of the United States. And they had only looked at the case. They prosecuted the trafficker who was advertising young girls. So I said, have you ever looked at it on the next level up? When we looked at it at the next level up, to the finance and to the advertising online, it was connected to organized crime that was connected to the Middle East, to the UK, and to Latin America. And that's now moved to a much bigger investigation. So we're missing those opportunities. We'd never do that with terrorism or money laundering. We would look at the next level. But one of the issues I brought up recently was around, Duncan knows a lot about this, is what's known as pig butchering. So this is where people will be trafficked in Southeast Asia, or Africa mainly. They're taken and they're almost kidnapped. They're held in these warehouses, and they're made and ordered to actually do online fraud. And these will take many complex ways, and they will be defrauding people in the United States. One of the hardest areas that's been hit is California, probably because it's got a lot of elderly people who have got pensions and disposable cash. But we are talking about 800 million was taken from US citizens last year. And of course, so we have to have that ability to investigate outside of our own jurisdictions, because that is protecting our own people as well. We've got a duty, and us as people of faith, one of the biggest things and privileges you can have in the world is to help someone that you never meet. I think that's a real privilege, to be able to help those who are in most impoverished situations, but you've never met them. That is something really dignified. But if you look at it as well, that the way that the crimes have developed, and particularly if we look at some of the biggest brands in the world, will be using cobalt, will be using mica. So every car will have mica in the paint. Every electric car will have cobalt. Every electrical system in a car, computer, phone will have cobalt within it. That's being mined by children around the world. And there are 22,000 children that die every year in exploitative working conditions or hazardous working conditions. Now, we get very sensitive, and particularly at the moment, of aircraft disasters, and the reaction to aircraft disasters is absolutely where it should be, because there's a major loss of life. And of course, we've seen aircraft grounded, particularly previously when two of the same type of aircraft crashed and the CEO lost their job. There's still an inquiry going on, compensation. The state kicks in because it created danger. 22,000 children die every year, and not one CEO has lost their job. Not one prosecution of a company. Nobody's been investigated. No family has been compensated, not even for the funeral or to pay the costs. And yet these companies are making billions and billions and billions in profit. So I'm not saying that that's bad. Of course, capitalism is brilliant. It's needed to make countries wealthy, to give opportunities. But we have to have, dignity for everybody who is in the work and the work supply chains. And I think that we need to start making sure through laws, through regulation, through governance, and that's one thing Praeveni is very much into, and that's Duncan's expertise, is that we do have ways of making it accountable. And in Australia, I helped them develop their legislation some years ago. And when I went there and it got the front pages of the Australian Sydney Gazette, which is the main paper in Australia, and I said, until a CEO is in the dock, nothing will change. And I know that sounds terrible and seems like a very, as it were, over robust way. But if 22,000 children are dying, if there is 50 billion people who are trafficked around the world, if it's creating 236 billion of illicit funds, surely we need to see some people who are benefit from that in the dock, or at least losing their jobs.
Well, and Duncan, I did want you to also talk a little bit. Something I've learned from you is this idea of the fishing industry as being also a place where human trafficking happens, but also the clothes we wear. These are also things that in the global supply chain, as a consumer, I might not realize that human trafficking might be involved in some of the things that I buy. And so, I would love your explanation of how pervasive this really is in our society.
So I think, going back to the lesser known aspects, I think that is exactly the pervasive nature of exploitation in the global economy is the lesser known fact, because what is the accepted fact is that we buy something at point of sale and it's been made in a perfectly acceptable manner because we're buying it legitimately. We're not going to the black market to buy an illicit good. We're going to a shop to buy something over the counter, and the acceptance is, on a sort of cultural, sociological perspective, it's fine. If it's got to me and it's on the shelf, it must be good. So the less known problem is very much that it isn't fine, and exactly as Kevin said and Fred said, is that this is happening at a scale that is both exceptional and unique for the human history. And I think that's partly because we now have global supply chains. We didn't have those up until really the 1980s and 90s anyway. And if you take, for instance, an example of two global industries, both fishing and apparel. First of all, the fishing industry was largely decimated after the Second World War. And so fishing vessels themselves were used by navies as naval vessels. And so they all went for obvious reasons. And so there was a massive investment by the US and a couple of others, Japanese, to rebuild fishing fleets, the Spanish, and they got built in the 40s and 50s. And a couple of things occurred. First is sonar and radar. They both created the opportunity to navigate and also to find fish. The second thing is a hydraulic winch. So now you have something that was really, in the first part of the 20th century, an artisanal, local commercial enterprise to something that becomes the global supply chains of fishing that we now see. The one thing you then need is you need to haul the fish out of the sea. Now, that can't be done by robots because it's a much more kind of nuanced and subtle physical work. So you're going to have people. And as fishing stocks, because of sonar and everything else, because fishing stocks are then depleted, you're going to go further and further away from the coast. And that creates the opportunity to isolate people, to alienate them from their families. It reduces communication, particularly pre-internet. Mobile phones, but that doesn't really happen in the sea, open water anyway. So now you have a floating platform of human beings, all controlled under one or two, the captain and his crew. And the worst of it is that we know that some of these crews would operate what the Romans called decimate, which, the Romans used to do is they used to line their troops up and the 10th row would be killed to remind the other 9 rows what it was all about. And what can happen on these fishing vessels is that one person will be made an example of, perhaps in the extreme, to remind the others exactly what it's all about and how control functions. So this is a 20th century way of doing business. This is not something that occurred previously. And the same with the apparel industry. Suddenly you have marketing and branding that had never existed pre-20th century. And the way, and we think about things like the advertising industry and the way that Mad Men, whatever it might be, but brands occurred that they had never really existed before. So suddenly in fashion, the fashion industry moved from haute couture to pret-a-porter to just let's get as quickly as fast fashion as you possibly can. Let's cycle ideas and styles not by seasons but by weeks, and therefore you need to have production that can be changed every week. And with the internet, you then have point of sale being removed from physical space to the virtual space. Now what you've got is a need to churn very, very fast. And you need to have that available, which means you need a system of production that can be easily changed. It's very flexible and at the same time can be worked very hard. And therefore you're going to end up with situations of deep exploitation. And we see that repeatedly over and over again. The problem is that during the last 25 years is that it was starting to be believed, oh, we'd got over this. And there were individuals that said, we have solved this problem, which obviously is untrue. There were a number of funds set up that were supposed to tackle this that have had limited success. And in fact, one of these funds, which spent maybe $75 to $80 million, simply disappeared with very little success to show for itself. So what we also find that in 2025 is as an inflection point, and this has been precipitated by the collapse of USAID and the funding to DOL, because we have gone out and preached, be resilient, build your communities in the developing world. It took one source of funding to cut the knees of most of these things. And so there is a lack of resilience even within civil society. And so we are preaching resilience, but we're unable to establish it ourselves. So 2025 is going to be this point when we are going to look and say, okay, there was a moment where the truth will out. The truth is now much clearer as to exactly how far we've got and to exactly the size and scale of the problem in the 21st century, which is basically hitherto unseen before. And that's kind of where we are. And we are struggling as a society to grasp the fact that everything is not as we thought it was going to be. The future is not quite as bright and as shiny as modernism perhaps told us that it might be.
Thank you so much. In some ways, though, I want to make sure as we end this discussion that we end more on a positive note. Because boy, when we heard what everybody's thoughts are, it's pretty daunting. I mean, it sounds like a problem that maybe we can't solve. I do believe, and as we've expressed, we do have hope that this is something we can solve. A matter of fact, I do want to end with also the fact that last year was pretty significant in that in the final G20 communique, it included this group's, human trafficking group's, policy recommendations. And I think for me, that gives me hope that the G20 countries are behind this and that they are willing to help us deal with this problem that you have so well articulated in terms of what a huge issue it is right now in the world today.
Thank you, Kevin and Duncan and Fred, for sharing your expertise and your unique insights. We would love to hear about how our listeners can contribute to the combat against human trafficking. Fred, I'd love to hear your thoughts first.
All right, Kevin, your turn.
Take two.
And it is, I'd say August 10th through, I think we talked about 10th through 13th.
Okay.
August, yes.
Now my cheeks, I'm blushing too much. Okay. I'm going to steal a phrase I know Duncan was going to use. Be informed, don't be a spectator. Okay. And then something I know, Marianna, that you're aware of. If you see something online that you're wanting to buy or out in the marketplace and it's too good to be true, it probably isn't. It isn't true. Trafficking is involved in so many aspects of life and of our circumstances. Take time to inform yourself, be aware of what's going on in the marketplace by watching what you purchase, where you purchase it from. And I would also add, find out what's happening locally, say in your state. Familiarize yourself with state statutes about human trafficking. How do local law enforcement and the state attorneys general, the group that Kevin's working with, how do they cooperate? And I think you'll find there's scope for individuals to step in and provide support in ways you might not have imagined. The next IF20 forum meeting will take place in South Africa in August of this year, August 10th to the 14th. Human trafficking will be highlighted both in plenary session and in a breakout session. And there we hope to highlight the collaboration globally that is needed, as well as the governmental initiatives that need to be undertaken to prevent this.
Thank you, Fred. Kevin, do you have any thoughts about how our listeners can take what they've heard and apply it in their lives?
Yes, I mean, I think really Fred covers a number of it there. Know what's going on locally. See if there's something, if you do want to help, that you can help an existing organization, particularly those that are local, that may be helping victims, particularly where there is, a lack of resources, a lack of funding. And, many of the listeners here will be professionals, and some of the setups in UK and other parts of the world will have teachers and people who have got professions and people who can teach, people who've been exploited how to life skills, and that can go from even learning English or, learning to cook or many other skills that help us in life. And then there's some people who can give practical advice, people who've got a legal training or people who are very good at filling out application forms or helping people to apply for jobs or with immigration problems, etc. So there's many things that people can do in a very practical way that will be, very much welcomed on the ground. But going back to knowing about this and talking about it and getting it into the conversation locally, making it important to particularly your elected people. I know it's different in different parts of the world, but, there's elected, in the UK, we have elected police and crime commissioners, which are like your elected mayors or your elected police chiefs in some areas. You have senators, Congress reps, we have MPs, we have local councillors, we have local, like you have local senates, and people actually, particularly through faith groups, because you are part of a network that will have an important role within society. Start thinking about how you can start badgering those who are actually working for you and saying to them, we want this to be a priority in our state, in our community, in our area, in our country. And we're doing this, and again, for people of faith, because this is something that is required of us as decent human beings. And we're not going to tolerate it in our community. We want the people who are suffering helped. We want those who are committing the crimes punished. And we want an attitude, a culture where it's about prevention. This is something you just don't do. And I think through the networks of faith, whatever faith that is, through the networks of spirituality, through the networks of people of goodwill, the more that we get people saying that, the more that will become the norm in society. And that will feed into those who are in positions of authority, positions of decision making, because they are generally elected by us.
Thank you, Kevin. Duncan, would love to hear from you on this idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say to listeners, don't do it. I mean, I'm not talking about joining organized crime, which you should not do. I'm talking about if you work in supply chains, which a lot of people do, then if you are suspicious or you feel there's a risk that you are encouraging or purchasing or involved in the manufacture that exploits people, then you need to stop. And that's a lot of people are involved in global supply chains. The second thing you don't do is you don't buy goods that are going to profit from exploitation. So those are two things that you should not do. What you need to do is you need to have courage, because actually following through with those two things is not easy at all. It's extremely hard. And to Marianna's point about having hope, I think you should differentiate as a listener between having hope, because the reason to have hope is that we're not unclear about what needs to be done. What needs to be done has been set out by Kevin and Fred and myself and Marianna and Stuart here. So we have hope because we know what we need to do. We need to get on and do it. We are not hoping that something is going to happen. We know we need to do it, and it's up to us on this call and many other people to deliver. So don't do it, and have courage and act. And as the other two said, and as Hannah Arendt wrote in Human Condition, think before you act. Don't just do stuff and hope it's going to happen. Be informed, be understanding, and think before you do things. But act.
Thank you, Duncan, for your thoughts. And one thing I would add is that the IF20 holds monthly webinars where you can learn about these issues and you can be informed. And the next one will be happening on June 26th, Thursday, June 26th, and those are at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So please see the website to be able to tune into those. This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Duncan and Kevin and Fred, for your thoughts. And I've been motivated and inspired, and I know that our listeners will too. Marianna, do you have any thoughts before we close?
Yes, I do. I just want to kind of underscore what Duncan said here as we end. This wonderful discussion has continued my hopeful feelings, but I love the fact that you talk very specifically about it's not enough just to have hope, we have to do. And everybody who listens to this, I hope that you have come up with some ideas of things that you can do to help us in this important cause of stopping human trafficking. So I want to thank the listeners for being a part of this discussion and hope that you will continue to help us in this important cause. Thank you so much for joining us today.
The podcast provides information and discussions on the G20 Interfaith Forum, but the views expressed are those of the individuals involved and not necessarily the official stance of the forum.
The content is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice or expert recommendations. Listeners should exercise personal responsibility, seek professional guidance, and conduct further research when making decisions based on the podcast.
The information shared may not always reflect the most current developments, and external links or resources are provided for additional information but are not endorsed or controlled by the podcast.
By listening to the podcast, listeners acknowledge and accept these disclaimers. Please be aware that the content of this podcast may be subject to copyright. Unauthorized copy, distribution, and reproduction of any part of the podcast is prohibited.